Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 2 of my Final Fantasy XIV lore series. Today we'll be covering the timeline from the Ascians all the way up to the fall of the Allagan Empire. This video will contain lore spoilers, so nothing that'll actually ruin the storyline, but will contain things that are revealed later in Final Fantasy XIV's MSQ, so continue at your own discretion. Lastly, as always, please like and subscribe below to see the continuation of this series and many more videos to come this year. So now we begin at the end of the creation myth, with the gods leaving the world and the custodianship of man. Mankind in this period was not divided into the multitude of races we know today, but instead consisted purely of the ancient ones, or as they are more commonly known as, the Ascians. While the specifics of Ascian culture at their peak of the civilization are lacking, we do know a few key points. First is that their people were present in all corners of the world, and they were highly proficient at a type of sorcery called creation magic, through which they not only created utopian megacities, but also populated the planet with other creatures. Through experimentation with life itself, even the fauna and flora of the world at the time was in perfect harmony. In appearance, they primarily all dressed in long black robes with plain white masks covering just the eyes and most of the forehead, with the exception of the ruling body of the Ascians, who wore red masks of varying shapes and sizes. My best guess for why this is the case is to reduce individualism amongst the population to make sure they, as a collective, could maintain the equilibrium they had achieved on the planet. As everyone had access to creation magics, any rogue member or group had the potential to do terrible damage to the harmony that the Ancients had achieved. To further ensure this balance was maintained, the Ancients were ruled by a council known as the Convocation of 14. Each seat of the council served a specific purpose and was named after its first seat holder. Once appointed the Convocation, a new member would take on the name of their seat, as well as move from a white mask onto a red one, which was the only real symbol of status in Ascian society. Considering the sheer reach of the ancient society across the globe, it can be presumed that this society existed for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. The exact timing is completely unrecorded, as it occurs well before what we'd consider the start of modern Eorzean history. We do, however, know that at some point a calamity known as the Final Days began, which started by twisting the very creation magics that the Ascians relied on so heavily against them, starting with simple tremors on the earth, which soon evolved into rains of fire and nightmarish creatures which spawned into existence. The planet itself twisted and burned until the Convocation made a fateful decision. This was to summon a god to save their people and avert the Final Days. With the normal sources of magic being corrupted by the processes of the apocalypse, in order to accomplish this summoning, half of the Ascian population sacrificed the aether of their bodies and souls into the ritual. This summoned the god Zodiac into the world, and with his mighty powers absorbed the terrible energy causing the Final Days, and in so doing, forestalled it. Seeing this dark titan, however, some of the remaining Ascians thought Zodiac was too terrible a force to keep unchecked, so using what magic they themselves could find, which was easier now that the end times were averted, still required sacrifice. And through that sacrifice, they created a counterbalance in the goddess Heidelin. She, who was born of light, battled Zodiac to a standstill, and while not being able to defeat him outright, eventually managed to shatter him into 14 pieces. The original world on which the Ascians walked became known as the Source, and the 13 other pieces of Zodiac became known as shards, which were exact reflections of the world at the time of this sundering. These shards were intrinsically linked to the Source through etheric means, and became effectively parallel dimensions. Each of these dimensions began at the same point in history, and were fated to evolve in their own particular ways now that the Ascians were all but extinct through the summoning of both gods. From this point forward, we'll be exclusively concerned with the Source. That is where Final Fantasy XIV takes place, and the specific events of other shards don't really concern us until their very end, as the Ascians didn't completely die out between the summoning of Zodiac and his subsequent shattering. Those who remained endeavoured to rejoin all the shards back into the Source. They do this by tipping the balance of aether on those shards to the point that it is all-consuming. Once a type of aether is all-consuming on a shard, it starts to wash back into the Source through that link that was formed when the sundering occurred. When this happens, the shard is destroyed, and an event known as a calamity occurs on the Source that ushers in a time known as an Astral Era. These calamities come in many forms depending on the element that was used to destabilize the shard in the first place, and can vary in length from days to months to years. These umbral eras are then followed up by astral ones, which normally last between 1,000 to 2,000 years, which is when mankind flourishes. Interestingly, before we get on to that cycle of astral and umbral eras as we know them now, there's an entire period of prehistory where it's very likely that each of the races we all know evolved independently of each other. I'll go into the origins of each of the races in their own dedicated video. However, as far as we're concerned, they all did exist in their primitive forms by the start of modern Eorzean history, that being the first umbral Astral Era, the Calamity of Wind. This would have consisted of tornadoes, tempests, and terrifying winds so powerful as to rip trees from the ground and flesh from bone. As this calamity began, it's very likely that everyone not within a cave system or other natural wind barrier would have perished. While not properly recorded, it's also likely this calamity would not have lasted any more than a few days, and once it ended, we officially began the first Astral Era, the Age of Tools. Prior to the first calamity, the mortal races were mostly nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, which started to change rapidly after the storms died down. With the wind stripping a lot of the regular prey and gatherable vegetation, it became a necessity to start developing tools, then agriculture, and much like our own history, permanent settlements began to develop soon after. The basic technological advancements in animal husbandry, metallurgy, and political sciences were also conceived over the next 1,000 or so years, until the land was dotted with various petty kingdoms. As is a king's wont, however, the sciences soon moved to focusing on the concepts of war. Plowshares converted to swords, as the many kingdoms that had risen all fell into increasingly violent wars for supremacy. To fuel this constant state of warfare, nature herself was torn asunder for the natural resources required, such that the first Astral Era descended into bloody madness and ecological devastation in its closing years. The actual finale to AE1 was the second Umbral Era, the Calamity of Lightning. It began with the mountains of fire belching columns of black clouds into the sky, covering the world in darkness. From those darkened skies, bolts of white-hot lightning struck the earth with terrifying force. Crops burned, lakes boiled, and the great fortresses of every kingdom in the land was crumpled with contemptuous ease. This lasted for a full 12 days and nights. The majority of people left outside were killed, and those who did manage to retreat underground suffered from plagues and pestilence which spread rapidly amongst the tightly packed masses. Between the wrath from above and the deadly sickness going through the surviving camps, people turned to the gods for salvation, offering whatever prayers they could to the 12. Through those prayers, the first magical incantations began to take place to heal the sick and keep the torches alight. Once those 12 days ended, the skies finally cleared, and the second Astral Era begun, the Age of Faith. Society rapidly changed coming out of those caves, with prayers and magic in hand. The kingdoms that were so powerful merely years ago quickly became theocracies, with a multitude of religions springing up throughout the world. A boom of reconstruction began in the ruined towns and cities, with a high emphasis on temples, cathedrals, and monuments to the gods, which quickly became some of the most magnificent buildings ever created by mortal hands. Stonemasonry, goldsmithing, and all of the arts accelerated in the early years of AE2, as the people pushed for even more beautiful ways to venerate their gods. As the centuries passed, the zealotry of the people only grew, which allowed each of the theocracies to centralize more and more power in their respective states. As the old saying goes, however, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and soon more mortal desires crept into the minds of the higher priesthoods. The desire for more power grew, and soon their own religions, born out of benevolent necessity, began to be twisted to justify atrocity. Dissenters to the state were burned as witches, men, women, and children of other faiths sold into slavery, towns and cities burned, and the world once more descended into near universal warfare to spread their religions through blood and iron. As the people were completely devoted to their own religions, most marched out to war, which left very few on the home front. With nobody to tend the fields, harvests failed, and soon, as many people that were being killed on the front lines were also dying of starvation at home. Once more, another Astral Era became known for its violence and greed, but as it was before, it only came to an end with a third Umbral Era, the Calamity of Fire. Over the course of a few days, the sun grew larger and larger, as if coming closer to the world itself. The days became longer, and the heat became nigh on unbearable. Those who wished to survive once again had to take shelter in the depths of the earth, and hope the heat would no longer reach them there. Soon, once verdant field, lush forest, and the great many lakes were reduced to ash-choked wastelands. Animals and mortals alike caught outside of the peak of the calamity simply burned away, with only charred bones remaining. Once the sun retreated back into its normal place in the heavens, famine soon became commonplace, as no harvest sown into the earth before the calamity survived. It was in this terrible place for mankind that the third Astral Era began, the Age of Technology. It became apparent to the communities that emerged from the underground bunkers that the divine could no longer be the centerpiece of their society. They had already now tried that, and it still incurred the wrath of the gods. So, while the gods were still respected, mankind sought to distance itself from them. So, faith in the gods was replaced by faith in the individual, and with this newfound confidence did the people strive to better themselves and the world. Technology and science became the new centerpieces of society, with advances both big and small occurring on a daily basis. The population exploded as agriculture and medicine improved. The lives of the common man were better than ever. It had truly become the best time to be alive in all of modern history. Into this environment entered a man named Xander. This man was charismatic, a genius in his own right, and above all, very, very ambitious. At a young age, he leveraged his talents to become the leader of his people, and with them established the nation of Allag. Allag, like many of the nations being built at the time, was founded in science. However, it was also very open to magic. Xander made an effort to invite the descendants of the old priests and witches of previous ages to his nation so they could experiment and hone their skills in magic to the benefit of the people. The best of this group began being handpicked by Xander to join his growing army as the first recorded use of battle mages, and, with them, began subjugating his neighbours with exceptionally few casualties on the Allag side. In a campaign that took less than a year, he consolidated the entire continent of Aldenard and proclaimed the Allagan Empire, with himself as emperor. Afterwards, Xander didn't focus on claiming the rest of the world. In fact, quite the opposite. He spent his time consolidating his holdings and grooming his children to carry on his legacy, and carried on they did. After his death, the direct descendants of Xander led armies through Isilbard and Othard, so that in barely another generation, the three great continents all flew the Imperial Allag banner. With no more direct enemies to fight, a true golden age for all the people of Allag began. Peace, prosperity, and the greatest achievement of all, the Psychus Tower, or as it would later be known, the Crystal Tower, was built. This tower was designed as basically be a hyper-efficient solar panel which provided energy for a vast portion of the Empire. The last major improvement to the Empire was the creation of highly advanced robots and machina, which at first took on the basic manual labouring jobs of the Empire, but slowly took on more and more responsibility as the technology behind them improved. After many centuries, eventually these machina could perform any and all work required for society to function in earnest, so the focus on further learning slowly shifted to advancements in pure leisure. Birth rates plummeted, corruption grew, and leaders became increasingly complacent, which occasionally led to uprisings, which were then brutally put down by the many war machines of the Allag Empire. It's likely that if nothing was done, the Empire would implode under its own weight, and if it had held course for even another generation, it would have. But as fate would have it, a brilliant scientist by the name of Amon decided to intervene. He alone didn't have the charisma or power to correct the course of the Empire and rouse it from its self-induced slumber, but he knew someone who could, the first Emperor Xander. Through the combination of cloning and what can only be described as genetic necromancy, Amon first perfected immortality, and then applied it to dead flesh, first experimenting on revolutionaries, then on Xander's relatives, and then, lastly, on himself. After a great many fatalities in his obsessive quest to resurrect the first emperor, he finally found the solution. Having Xander's body recovered from the tomb that he had been resting in for nearly 1,000 years, he took it to his laboratory in the capital, and then, with the power of the Crystal Tower, did he accomplish his magnum opus. Xander returned to the world once more. After being given a history lesson of the past millennium, and a briefing on what resources were available to him, did Xander get to work. First was the Machiavellian task of killing the current emperor, and any other family members who even came close to posing a legitimate threat to his new regime. He wasted no time to start the process in riding the ship of his old empire in the same way that he had done at the start, through military conquest. While the three great continents were under his direct command, there still remained many places in the world still ripe for conquest, and so he set his sights south to Mericidia. The people came out of their malaise with renewed purpose. The army grew exponentially, the fires of industry once more lit up as demand for material of war once more increased, and the scholarly circles convened once more to invent new methods of waging war. Once in an acceptable state, the great navy and air fleet of the Allagan Empire sailed south. At first, the incursions into Mericidia were very successful. The surprising and brutal assault of the Allagans quickly allowed them to establish beachheads and push further south into the continent. What they weren't expecting, however, was for the southern people to quickly unify in response to this existential threat, and not unified under any mortal power, but under the authority of the dragons. In a time since lost, the dragons came to this world and had settled on Mericidia. While not known when, they made peace with the mortals who had settled there and had lived in relative harmony for generations. Now though, that harmony had been shattered, and both man and dragon stood united against imperial aggression. Nothing on the three great continents had prepared the imperial army for the fury of the dragons. Not the men of the army, their machines, or scientifically enhanced war beasts could withstand the dragon's flames, and so the united southern hordes made headway in not just halting, but pushing back the Allagans. This kind of warfare was exactly what Xander wanted, and he used this to further motivate the men and women of Allag to even more impressive feats of engineering and science to combat this new threat. The most powerful of these creations was known as Kalea, a solid metal hydra almost totally impervious to the fangs, talons, and flames of the dragons. These new advances eventually turned the tides of war once more in Allag's favour, and during a decisive victory story, they saw most of the dragon host in Mericidia destroyed, including the Dawn Worm Bahamut. After this battle, the dragons could no longer commit to the fight nearly as much as they could out of fear of extinction, and so the mortals of the Mericidian horde turned to their gods for salvation. The gods seemed to answer. In the first recorded summoning of an icon, or primal, which is a magical entity powered through aether and faith, did the Mericidians summon the warring triad, Sephiroth the fiend, Sophia the goddess, and Zervan the demon. With them, they had regained the initiative and once more threatened to push the Allagans back from whence they came. For the Allags, it wasn't an issue of being able to kill these summoned gods. It was that the Mericidians were able to simply resummon them back to wreak terrible havoc once more each time they slew one. Xander pressed his mage cause to find a solution, promising to kill a mage until one was found. And after an undisclosed amount of mage murder, the Allagans both had a rudimentary understanding of summoning magics, but also how to imprison the icons. And so they did, tying their essence to technologically sophisticated prisons, which they then turned into massive magical batteries to power the war effort. The Mericidians, even without their three gods, weren't finished. They still had one more trick up their sleeve. As summoning was not an exclusive right of the mortal races, it was Tiamat, the sister of Bahamut, who would summon her brother back into existence. However, this simulacrum of her brother was nothing like the original. It was twisted by the same rage that Tiamat herself felt towards the Allagans, and with a single-minded determination and ferocity did Bahamut Reborn fight the men of Allag. But this time, it was Xander and his mages' turn to pull some Deus Ex Machina, as through their exploration into summoning magic, they found the Void, and its ruler, the Cloud of Darkness. They quickly entered a pact by which Xander would provide a host for the entities of the Void to possess, and those Void soldiers in return would fight for him in Mericidia. Soon, any casualty, either on the side of Allag or the Mericidians, was given to the Void as a host, and as this dark army became effectively unstoppable as it went through the continent as a human wave, even eventually managing to overwhelm Bahamut Reborn through sheer strength of numbers. Having learned their lessons with previous icons, instead of killing Bahamut outright, they decided to imprison him within a giant iron sphere that would later become known as Dalamud. This was the final triumph before Xander could officially declare his victory to his reinvigorated empire. With victory came peace, and with peace again came boredom. For the nigh immortal Xander, who had tasted death once already, he came to the conclusion that life was effectively meaningless and descended into madness. Desiring only distraction, he took Dalamud to focus Bahamut's energy into opening a void gate, such that the Cloud of Darkness herself could come into the mortal realm and purge it of life. This plan quickly caught the attention of basically everyone in the Allagan Empire, and outside of a few staunch loyalists, a resistance army marched upon Xander at the Crystal Tower. While they were too late to stop Xander from actually activating the device, he had made one miscalculation. The very land around the tower could not handle the sheer amount of energy being used to power the tower, and soon the Earth itself opened up and consumed the tower whole. This ultimately prevented the activation of Dalamud and spared the world from the wrath of the Cloud of Darkness. It was not, however, spared the fourth Umbral Era. That, ladies and gentlemen, is where we end today's video. The last part of the timeline will be coming out next week, which will be covering everything from the fourth Umbral Era all the way until your character takes their first steps into the world of Eorzea. So if you don't want to miss it, please subscribe below and give the video a like so other people can see it too. Until next time, I hope you have an absolutely excellent week.